Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to CLS Social Studies. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the Southern demographics in the time of 1790 to 1860. While the Industrial Revolution is going on in the North, the institution of slavery is leading the economy of the South. So when we talk about Southern demographics, here's what we know. Yes, there were a lot more white Southerners than there were enslaved Africans in the South. Okay, but we're going to break down those those white Southerners into three different groups, and then we're going to talk about the slaves. So we're going to go over four groups of people in the South. The first group we're going to cover, they're the smallest group of people in the South. They are what we call the planters. That makes up about a half to 1% of the white Southern demographic. They were usually the wealthiest members of society. These were the people that owned huge plantations, hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves. They were the ones who pretty much controlled the economy, controlled the government of the South. The men were more concerned with their crops and their slave laborers than really anything else. It's the wives that raised the children, ran the household, held the parties, meaning social duties. And the marriages of the planters were usually arranged, kind of like royalty. Royalty would want to, keep the blood pure, and they would arrange weddings to make stronger allies with different countries. Well, the planters were the same way. They had the money. They wanted to keep the money. If they married somebody else with money, that would give them more money. Okay, so that was the idea with the planters. You have to think of them as and you can't think of them as royalty because it was such a great thing, but they were like the royalty of the Southern white demographic. They were the ones who had the money, the power, the control. They owned the most slaves and owned the biggest lots of land. That brings us to the second smallest group of people in the South, and these were called yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers were mostly white farmers. They had small farms, averaged 100 acres. They would have a handful up to 20, 30, maybe 40 slaves, and they would do work alongside the slaves. They didn't have the money to own thousands or hundreds of slaves, but they could own some. This made up about 25% of the Southern white demographic. Okay, so you have the wealthy elites, then you have the yeomans right underneath them. This would have been like the middle class farmer if you were to try to compare it with something to today. The big difference there's many differences between the planters and the yeomans, but the ones we're going to look at now is the yeomans had a smaller farm, only about 100 acres. They owned less slaves, but again, the thing about the yeoman farmers is the yeoman farmer would work in the farm or on the farm next to the slaves, and they would work long days, long hours. Out of the whole white population, only a small part really owned slaves, because you have the wealthy planter at the top in this hierarchy of Southern demographic. You have the white planters up on top, the very small few. Then you have the yeomans, who are a bigger group that own less slaves. But then the last group of whites in the South would be the poor whites. These are the people that lived on really terrible land. They couldn't even grow crops. They would survive by hunting, fishing, small gardens, doing odd jobs. So when you look at the South, many people are under the illusion that many Southerners owned slaves. Not every Southerner owned slaves. Now, when you talk about the Civil War, right, you have a lot of these poor whites who are fighting for the Civil War, or who are fighting to save the institution of slavery, and some of them didn't even own slaves. Okay, so this is what we have to look at here. About 75% of that Southern population were poor whites, people who couldn't even have farms to even have slaves. So what does that leave as the largest population? If you took that white demographic and divided them up amongst the three, this would leave the largest population in the South, which is slaves. The majority of the slaves lived in rural areas, worked on plantations. Those are those really big farms of hundreds, thousands of acres. They would work in the field with hundreds or thousands of slaves. Okay, most of them were the field hand in the slaves using the gang labor system, meaning all the slaves are doing the same thing at the same time. Men, women, and children older than 10 years old would do the same type of work sun up to sundown with no concern of the weather or any type of illness. Okay, so you have to put, southern part of the United States now, you're talking about, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Ultimately, we'll go out to Texas. You have these slaves who we've covered before, getting chained, whipped, beat with clubs, shackled with irons, okay? Getting beat for obedience. Not only that, they have to work day in and day out, picking cotton and stuff like that. Picking cotton is not an easy thing to do. Those cotton seeds, they get hard, they'll cut your hands. These slaves are being forced to do this in the South. Some other slaves would work as butlers, cooks, or nurses in the planter's house. These were normally the older slaves, the weaker slaves. For the cooks and the nurses, these were more of the lighter-skinned female slaves. Something you have to know, a part of slavery, the part of the past of slavery, besides the harshness of the treatment of the slaves and the making them work in the fields, many slave women were raped by their planter, by their slave owner. Now, yes, sometimes the butlers would have better food, they would have better clothing than the field hands. They had better shelter. They might live at the basement of the planter's house, but they usually had to work longer hours because sundown didn't mean that they had to stop working. So even the slaves that were working on the inside of the house as butlers were still getting treated poorly. Some slaves were able to work skilled jobs such as a blacksmith or a carpenter, and we got into this last time when we talked about the free blacks in the South. Few slaveholders, now a few, would allow their slaves to actually sell their labor to other people, and they would in turn make that money and give it back to their slave owner. And some slaves actually earned enough money to be able to buy their freedom. The number was small. Most of these planters, these slave owners in the South, were people that really wanted to take control of their slave labor. They really wanted to make sure and get all that money from the slave labor, because that is what the Southern economy was built on. So let's look at some beliefs. Most white Southerners at this time were Christians. They had the same similar religious beliefs. They only saw their neighbors once in a while because their plantations, like I said, were thousands of acres large. And if you have one next to the other, you very rarely saw your neighbors. So when did you see them? You saw them on Sunday at church. Wealthy white Southerners thought that religion justifies their place in society and that God created some people in this world to rule over others. That made that made them feel justified in their place in slavery. And this was preached at church every week, where those white, wealthy Southerners, those planters, were put on planet Earth to be in charge of another race. So Southern cities were on the Atlantic coast, as like I said before, Charleston, Savannah, they became shipping centers of the cotton. City governments would build water systems and maintain their streets to make sure to get the cotton to them. Most education in the South was done privately, but there was some public education offered. And again, slaves did most of the work in the cities. So let's look at some of these plantations, what a plantation looks like. This is a plantation house. It was huge. The planter and his family lived here, lots of room, very little people. Then you had slave cabins. They were packed into small cabins with earthen floors, meaning dirt floors. You had so many slaves in one cabin with dirt floors. Then you had a cotton ginning shed. These are the shed that would put the cotton gin in there because you wanted to make sure and protect that cotton gin if you were a planter, because you don't want that machine to break down, because then that would slow down your cotton production. You did have some other buildings like the overseer's house, the person who would oversee the slaves on the field. You had the barn for the horses, the stable for the horses, the barn for animals, the smokehouse to cook some meats. But you could see the difference between the planter up here with his house where his family lives and the slave shacks, the ones who are doing all of the work. All right, so we're going to get into next about the Southern economy and how much of it was based on slavery and cotton production in the South.